Around 116 BC, historical records suggest that, in the magnificent palace of Alexandria, a nearly 70-year-old queen closed her eyes for the final time. Cleopatra II had witnessed power, betrayal, and horrors beyond imagination. Throughout her life, she had married her own brother, watched her daughter be used as a political weapon against her, and according to some historical accounts, been forced to marry her own son in a brutal dynastic system. And most horrifying of all, historical sources describe how she received evidence of her child's violent death as what many consider the most cruel political message in ancient history. If this story sounds like a plot from a drama too dark to believe, sadly, this appears to represent the documented reality of the Ptolemaic dynasty, one of the most bloodthirsty royal families in ancient political history. This isn't just a story about power and politics. This is about how a system that sacrificed humanity for legitimacy could destroy everyone trapped within it. This story discusses extremely sensitive content, including incestuous relationships in ancient political contexts, violence against children, and mass executions, all discussed in educational context to understand extreme ancient political and cultural systems, not for sensationalism. There are several reasons why the Ptolemaic dynasty is considered both extraordinary and terrifying in ancient political history. They were direct descendants of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who inherited Egypt after the conqueror's death in 323 BC. For nearly 300 years, from 305 BC to 30 BC, they ruled as pharaohs, combining Greek and Egyptian traditions in ways never seen before. What made them unique and tragic was their practice of extreme endogamous marriage. Unlike other dynasties that married foreign nobility for political alliances, the Ptolemies almost exclusively married close family members. Of 15 recorded royal marriages in this dynasty, 10 were between siblings. This practice, which they claimed was inspired by the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, created centuries of political and personal trauma. From all these systemic problems, Cleopatra II was born around 185 BC, into a world where power politics and family relationships had become one inseparable entity. She wasn't just a victim of this system. Historical records show she would also become one of its most decisive players in the dynasty's evolution. Few people realize that Cleopatra II would become the central figure in what modern historians call the most chaotic period in Ptolemaic history. Her story isn't just about one individual, it's about how a political system that worshipped blood purity could create its own destruction. To understand Cleopatra II's character development, we must examine the extremely rigid, politically oriented royal education system of the Ptolemies. Records from Alexandria show that royal children were educated not for personal happiness, but as future political instruments. Cleopatra II was born to Ptolemy V Epiphanes and Cleopatra I during a period when Egypt faced external pressure from the Seleucid Empire and internal threats from native Egyptian revolts. This political context heavily influenced her education. The Ptolemaic royal education system required mastery of at least 3 languages: Greek as the court language, Latin for diplomacy with the increasingly powerful Rome, and Egyptian hieroglyphs for religious legitimacy. Historian Plutarch noted that the Ptolemies, unlike most other Hellenistic rulers, tried to maintain connections with ancient Egyptian traditions to strengthen their legitimacy as pharaohs. Most importantly for Cleopatra II's future was the indoctrination about royal blood purity. Royal children were taught that marriage with siblings wasn't just tradition, it was religious and political obligation. This justification was based on the myth of Osiris and Isis, where sibling marriage was considered the way to maintain divine purity in the bloodline. However, the psychological impact of this system was deeply complex. Modern research of papyrus documents from this period shows that royal children often experienced internal conflict between normal human instincts and dynastic political demands. Around 175 BC, as Cleopatra II came of age, she entered the most crucial phase of the Ptolemaic political system: strategic marriage with her brother, Ptolemy VI Philometor. This marriage wasn't the result of romantic courtship. It was a political decision made by the Regency Council governing the kingdom. Context becomes clear when we examine Egypt's geopolitical situation. The Seleucid Empire under Antiochus IV Epiphanes was threatening from the north, while Rome was beginning to show increasingly aggressive interest in Eastern Mediterranean politics. In this situation, Egypt's internal stability became the top priority. The co-regency system implemented in Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VI's marriage was a fairly unique political innovation. Instead of following a single monarchy model, they ruled as a royal couple with nearly equal authority. Official documents from this period show that major decisions were often made in both rulers' names. Interestingly, this marriage, at least in official documentation, appeared more stable than most other Ptolemaic political marriages. They had several children, including a daughter who would be known as Cleopatra III, a figure who would later play a complex role in the dynasty's destruction. But here's where things get complicated. This stability would soon be tested by a third element in the political equation: Ptolemy VIII Euergetes II, later known as Physcon, their ambitious and strategic younger brother. Ptolemy VIII, later known as Physcon, presumably due to his portly appearance, represents a classic example of how the Ptolemaic succession system could create destructive internal conflict. As the third brother in the hierarchy, he grew up with structural frustration that eventually exploded into brutal political ambition. Ptolemy VIII's first opportunity to seize power came during the crisis of the Sixth Syrian War, 170 to 168 BC, when Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Empire attacked Egypt. Historical records show that while Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II were fighting to defend Alexandria, Ptolemy VIII began building alternative support networks. What made this situation more complex was Roman intervention. When Antiochus IV nearly succeeded in conquering Egypt, Rome sent an ultimatum forcing the Seleucid forces to withdraw. But this rescue came with a high political price. Rome now had greater influence over Egypt's internal politics. In the chaos following the war, Ptolemy VIII launched his coup around 164 BC. What made this betrayal so horrifying wasn't just its political aspects, but also its deeply personal and cruel dimensions. After securing power, Ptolemy VIII made a decision that would become one of the most controversial acts in Ptolemaic history. He married Cleopatra III, Cleopatra II's own daughter. This marriage wasn't just an ordinary political alliance. This was calculated humiliation designed to destroy Cleopatra II, both politically and psychologically. In ancient cultural context, marrying a niece wasn't completely unthinkable. But in the Ptolemaic political context, this act had much deeper meaning. By controlling the next generation of Cleopatra II's bloodline, Ptolemy VIII essentially claimed control over the dynasty's future. Most tragic was that Cleopatra III, though still young, apparently cooperated with this arrangement. Historical records don't clearly indicate whether she was forced or saw this as a political opportunity, but the result was the same. Cleopatra II lost not only her throne and husband, but her own daughter. This is the point where Cleopatra II's narrative changed from victim of the political system to something far more complex and ultimately more terrifying. Here's what actually happened after Ptolemy VIII's betrayal. It triggered the most admirable period in Cleopatra II's political career. Instead of surrendering to fate, she chose to fight back in a way that showed extraordinary political intelligence that had been hidden behind her role as traditional queen. Around 132 BC, Cleopatra II launched a rebellion against Ptolemy VIII that successfully drove him from Alexandria. Records from this period show she managed to mobilize extraordinarily broad support, not just from dissatisfied palace elites, but from ordinary Alexandrians who saw her as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The political strategy she used was brilliant. Instead of relying on traditional dynastic legitimacy, Cleopatra II positioned herself as the people's queen, fighting against corruption and betrayal. Papyrus from this period records that she frequently appeared in Alexandria's public forums, speaking directly to the people in both Greek and Egyptian, something rarely done by previous Ptolemaic rulers. What really impressed observers was her ability to maintain control over Alexandria for almost 3 years without adequate professional military support. She did this through a combination of clever diplomacy, effective populism, and above all else, deep understanding of how Egyptian bureaucracy worked. Ptolemy VIII's exile in Cyprus didn't last long. With support from Rome and several other regional powers, he began preparing a counterattack that would change everything. And here's where Cleopatra II's story takes its darkest and most unforgivable turn in ancient political history. Around 131 BC, in a desperate attempt to maintain power and unite the factions supporting her, Cleopatra II made a decision that would become one of the most controversial acts in political history. According to several historical sources, she married her own son, Ptolemy Memphis. This makes sense only when we consider the extremely desperate political context. Cleopatra II faced not only military pressure from Ptolemy VIII, but also internal support fragmentation, as various elite factions began questioning the legitimacy of her rule as sole ruler. In the Ptolemaic political system, legitimacy was always tied to bloodline and dynastic continuity. By marrying her son, who was technically a male heir with pure royal blood, Cleopatra II appears to have tried to create a new form of legitimacy. This combined her authority as queen with traditional expectations about male rule. Historical records about this period are very fragmentary, possibly because, even in its own time, this act was considered extremely controversial. Historian Josephus mentions this event briefly, while other sources seem to deliberately avoid detailed discussion. But what's certain is this: the marriage didn't last long. And what happened next was one of the most brutal acts of revenge ever recorded in ancient political history. When Ptolemy VIII finally managed to return to Alexandria around 130 BC, he brought with him a vengeance that had crystallized into systematic cruelty. What he did to Ptolemy Memphis, Cleopatra II's child, and simultaneously her husband, became a dark legend illustrating how far power politics could destroy all norms of humanity. According to records by historians Valerius Maximus and Justin, Ptolemy VIII didn't simply kill Ptolemy Memphis. Historical accounts suggest he ordered the systematic mutilation of the child's body, with remains reportedly sent to Cleopatra II as what sources describe as a birthday gift. This detail is so disturbing that even ancient sources seem reluctant to discuss it in detail. But the political significance of this act is clear. This wasn't just murder to eliminate a rival, but psychological warfare designed to destroy Cleopatra II, mentally and spiritually. In ancient cultural context, desecration of a body was one of the most severe forms of punishment, believed to hinder the soul's journey in the afterlife. By reportedly mutilating Ptolemy Memphis, Ptolemy VIII not only killed a potential rival, but also killed the possibility of the victim's spiritual salvation. The most chilling aspect was that this act achieved its intended psychological effect. Temple records indicate that after learning of her child's fate, Cleopatra II suffered a complete breakdown, followed by transformation into a paranoid and brutal ruler. The trauma from her child's murder transformed Cleopatra II into something very different from the people's queen she had once been. Records from the late period of her rule show patterns of increasing paranoia, arbitrary executions, and systematic elimination of anyone considered a potential threat. What most people don't know is that Cleopatra II, in her final years of power, reportedly developed a sophisticated intelligence network to identify and eliminate potential enemies. Papyrus from this period records the establishment of special tribunals that processed treason cases with alarming speed. The execution methods she used also showed escalation in brutality. Instead of using traditional methods like poisoning or strangulation that were relatively humane by ancient standards, records show she increasingly favored public executions deliberately designed to be maximally terrifying. Ironically, these terror tactics were initially successful in consolidating her control. Fear can be a very effective political tool, and for some time, the combination of terror and traditional royal legitimacy allowed Cleopatra II to maintain relative stability. However, as often happens with terror regimes, escalation became self-perpetuating. The more people she executed for suspected disloyalty, the more actual enemies she created, and the more paranoid she became, the more brutal methods she adopted for maintaining control. To truly understand Cleopatra II's tragedy, we need to step back and look at the cultural context that enabled all this horror to occur. Incestuous practices in the Ptolemaic dynasty weren't an aberration or deviation from normal cultural practices. This was a central feature of an entire political system that had been carefully constructed and maintained for centuries. The main justification for sibling marriage in Ptolemaic culture came from Egyptian religious tradition, specifically the myth of Osiris and Isis. In this mythology, Osiris and Isis were siblings who married and became king and queen of the gods. By imitating this divine marriage, Ptolemaic rulers claimed to maintain divine purity in their bloodline. But there were also very calculated, practical political reasons. In the complex Hellenistic political world, marriage alliances with foreign powers could create dangerous dependencies or competing loyalties. By exclusively marrying within the family, the Ptolemies ensured that royal power and wealth wouldn't be diluted or compromised by outside influences. Most disturbing was that the Egyptian priesthood actively supported and encouraged these practices. Records show that religious authorities didn't just tolerate incestuous marriages. They actively promoted them as religious necessity for maintaining divine order. The high priest of Ptah in Memphis, for example, reportedly issued proclamations explicitly stating that royal incest was imitation of divine order, necessary for ensuring the kingdom's prosperity. Temple inscriptions from this period show a clear pattern of religious endorsement for practices that by any modern standard constitute systematic child abuse. Modern genetic research shows that sustained inbreeding like that practiced by the Ptolemies would inevitably result in increased rates of genetic disorders, mental illness, and reduced fertility. Evidence from mummy studies suggests that many late Ptolemaic rulers indeed suffered from various forms of physical and cognitive impairments. But in their time, these problems were explained away as divine trials or political conspiracies, rather than natural consequences of genetic inbreeding. The cultural system had become so deeply invested in pure blood ideology that it was virtually impossible to question fundamental premises without undermining the entire structure of political legitimacy. One of the most challenging aspects of Cleopatra II's story is the difficulty in assessing moral responsibility for her actions. This question isn't just relevant for understanding this historical figure, but also for broader questions about how political systems can corrupt individuals and the extent to which personal agency exists in oppressive structures. On one hand, evidence shows that Cleopatra II was a genuine victim of a brutal and dehumanizing system. She was groomed from childhood to accept incestuous marriage as normal and necessary. She was betrayed by her brother-in-law and her own daughter in ways that would be traumatic for anyone. And she was forced to witness what historical sources describe as her own child's mutilated remains in an act of political revenge that was barbaric, even by ancient standards. The psychological impact of such experiences would be devastating for any person. Modern understanding of trauma suggests that exposure to such extreme violence and betrayal can fundamentally alter brain chemistry and decision-making capacity. In this context, the violent actions she took later in life could be seen as manifestations of severe PTSD rather than inherent evil. On the other hand, historical records also show that Cleopatra II made deliberate choices that contributed to others' suffering. Her decision to marry her own son, though politically motivated, was still a choice that violated basic human norms, even within her cultural context. And the reign of terror she conducted in her later years involved systematic killing of people possibly innocent of any genuine wrongdoing. What makes this moral calculation even more complex is the fact that, in certain respects, Cleopatra II was remarkably progressive for her time. She was one of the few Ptolemaic rulers who genuinely attempted to connect with ordinary people, rather than just ruling from an isolated palace. She demonstrated real political skill and intelligence that was unfortunately channeled toward increasingly destructive ends. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that Cleopatra II represents the tragedy of an individual corrupted by an inherently corrupt system. She was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, someone whose potential for good leadership was warped by exposure to extremes of political violence and family dysfunction. What's fascinating is how Cleopatra II's tragic reign shaped the development of future Ptolemaic rulers, particularly the famous Cleopatra VII, whom we know from her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Cleopatra VII was born almost a century after Cleopatra II's death, but the political and cultural legacy of her predecessor profoundly influenced how she approached rulership. Records show that Cleopatra VII deliberately studied the history of earlier Ptolemaic rulers, including specifically the cautionary example of Cleopatra II. One of the most important lessons Cleopatra VII learned was the danger of internal family conflict. Unlike many earlier Ptolemaic rulers, she took extraordinary steps to eliminate potential rival claimants within the family, including ordering the murders of both her siblings. While these actions were morally questionable, they demonstrated clear understanding that family loyalty could not be taken for granted in the Ptolemaic political system. Another crucial insight Cleopatra VII derived from studying her predecessor was the importance of maintaining popular support. Cleopatra II's brief success as people's queen showed that even in an autocratic system, a ruler who could mobilize mass support had significant advantage over rivals who relied purely on traditional legitimacy. The decisive factor was that Cleopatra VII learned to be extremely careful about marriage politics. Instead of following the traditional Ptolemaic pattern of sibling marriage, she chose to form alliances with powerful Roman leaders. This strategy was initially successful, but ultimately led to a different form of political disaster when Rome decided to directly annex Egypt. The pattern becomes clear. Cleopatra VII's story, with all its drama and ultimate tragedy, can be seen as an attempt to solve problems that first became apparent during Cleopatra II's reign. Both were intelligent, capable rulers trapped in a political system that demanded impossible moral compromises, and both were ultimately destroyed by contradictions inherent in trying to maintain traditional Ptolemaic power in the changing Mediterranean world. Medical historians and modern psychologists have extensively studied available evidence about Cleopatra II's mental state, particularly in the later years of her reign. This research provides valuable insights not only about her individual tragedy, but also about the broader psychological effects of extreme political stress and personal trauma. Evidence for Cleopatra II's psychological deterioration includes several documented changes in behavior patterns. Administrative records show that in the early years of her rule, she made decisions through consultation with advisors and careful consideration of political consequences. However, in the period following her child's murder, the decision-making process became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Papyrus from the late period of her rule shows patterns of contradictory orders, paranoid accusations against loyal officials, and obsessive focus on potential threats from enemies who possibly didn't exist. These symptoms are consistent with what modern psychology would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, combined with possible development of paranoid personality disorder. Particularly disturbing is evidence of increasing detachment from reality. Several accounts suggest that in her final years, Cleopatra II spent increasing amounts of time in private chambers, emerging only to issue execution orders or participate in increasingly elaborate religious ceremonies designed to purify the kingdom from invisible enemies. Temple records from this period describe bizarre rituals reportedly designed by Cleopatra II herself, involving elaborate offerings and ceremonies supposedly necessary for protecting Egypt from divine punishment. The content of these rituals suggests preoccupation with themes of death, purification, and revenge that clearly reflected personal psychological trauma. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this psychological decline was how it affected her relationship with people who genuinely cared about her. Accounts from court officials describe an atmosphere of fear in the palace, where even longtime servants were afraid to approach the queen due to unpredictable violent reactions. The tragedy of Cleopatra II cannot be fully understood without examining the broader political system that created conditions for such extreme corruption. The Ptolemaic monarchy represented one of the most concentrated forms of absolute power in the ancient world, and the effects of this concentration were predictably catastrophic. The fundamental problem with the Ptolemaic system was the elimination of all checks on royal power. Unlike political systems that incorporated elements of aristocratic council or popular assembly, the Ptolemaic monarchy concentrated virtually all decision-making authority in a single individual or small group of family members. This structure created several dangerous dynamics. First, it eliminated any institutional mechanism for correcting bad decisions or removing incompetent rulers. Once someone gained royal power, virtually no legitimate way existed to challenge their authority, regardless of how destructive their decisions became. Second, The concentration of power created enormous incentives for family members to engage in deadly competition for control. Because the stakes were so high, control over an entire kingdom and legitimate succession mechanisms were unclear. Internal family conflicts inevitably became extremely violent. Third, isolation from normal social feedback made it difficult for rulers to maintain realistic perspective about their actions. Surrounded by people dependent on royal favor for survival, rulers rarely received honest information about the effects of their policies or realistic assessment of their own capabilities. Most dangerously, absolute power created gradual erosion of moral constraints. When someone has the power to kill anyone who opposes them without consequences, normal human empathy and moral reasoning gradually atrophy. This process is clearly visible in Cleopatra II's progression from relatively reasonable young ruler to paranoid tyrant in her later years. Modern political science research confirms that the patterns observed in the Ptolemaic monarchy are not unique. Similar dynamics can be observed in any political system that concentrates too much power in the hands of individuals or small groups without adequate institutional constraints. From all this historical and psychological analysis, the tragedy of Cleopatra II offers several important lessons that remain relevant for understanding modern political dynamics and human nature more generally. The first and most obvious lesson is the danger of concentrating too much power in the hands of a single individual or small group. Regardless of how capable or well-intentioned leaders might be initially, sustained exposure to absolute power almost inevitably results in corruption, paranoia, and poor decision-making. The second lesson involves the relationship between family politics and broader political stability. The Ptolemaic experience demonstrates how systems that rely heavily on family loyalty for maintaining political cohesion are inherently unstable, because family relationships themselves can become weapons in political conflicts. The third lesson concerns the importance of institutional mechanisms for addressing leadership failures. Political systems that lack legitimate ways to remove destructive leaders or correct disastrous policies tend to experience more extreme forms of political violence when change finally occurs. Perhaps the most important lesson involves psychological understanding of how extreme political stress affects human decision-making. Cleopatra II's story illustrates how even intelligent, capable individuals can make terrible decisions when subjected to sustained trauma, isolation, and unlimited power. Most relevant to the modern context is recognition that political systems must be designed to accommodate human psychological limitations, rather than assuming that good intentions or personal virtue will be sufficient to prevent abuse of power. Ironically, many problems that destroyed Ptolemaic Egypt can be observed in various forms in contemporary political systems. Concentration of power in executive positions, lack of effective oversight mechanisms, nepotism in political appointments, and use of fear and violence to maintain control. All themes familiar in modern political analysis. The tragedy of Cleopatra II reminds us that political systems are fundamentally human creations, subject to the same psychological and moral limitations that affect all human behavior. Understanding these limitations and designing institutions to address them remains one of the most important challenges in political development. Cleopatra II died around 116 BC, after a reign lasting almost 20 years and marked by some of the most extreme violence in Ptolemaic history. At the time of her death, the kingdom she ruled was exhausted by constant warfare, depleted by economic mismanagement, and demoralized by systematic terror. The most devastating legacy was that the violence and trauma characterizing her rule did not end with her death. Instead, patterns of family conflict, political paranoia, and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain power continued to plague the Ptolemaic dynasty for the remaining decades of its existence. Her reign represented a turning point from which Ptolemaic Egypt never fully recovered. The kingdom that once represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic culture and learning gradually became increasingly isolated, backward, and dependent on outside powers for survival. When the Romans finally decided to directly annex Egypt in 30 BC, they were taking over a kingdom that had already been substantially weakened by internal conflicts that began during Cleopatra II's era. The legacy of political dysfunction she helped create made it impossible for subsequent rulers to mount effective resistance to Roman expansion. Yet in the midst of all this political tragedy, there remains something profoundly human about Cleopatra II's story. She was not a monster or evil genius, but rather an intelligent woman trapped in a political system that demanded impossible moral compromises. The choices she made, both good and bad, reflect fundamental tensions between personal desire for power and security versus broader moral obligations to society. Because ultimately, we are all products of the systems that create us, constrained by circumstances beyond our control, yet still responsible for the choices we make within those constraints. Cleopatra II's story reminds us that even in the most extreme circumstances, human agency still matters. And that understanding historical tragedy requires recognizing both the structural forces that shape individual behavior and the personal responsibility that remains with each of us. This isn't a story about a distant and irrelevant past. This is a mirror for understanding how power corrupts, how trauma creates cycles of violence, and how political systems can bring out either the best or worst in human nature. And in an era where concentration of power, family politics, and abuse of authority remain persistent problems, the lessons from Cleopatra II's tragic reign are more relevant than ever.